The Windsor Gala was supposed to be an evening of polished smiles, carefully chosen words, and royal unity. Instead, one quiet disclosure changed the temperature of the room. Sophie stepped forward, just as a private account from palace aides began circulating among senior members of the family, and what those aides said about Camilla was impossible to dismiss. Within minutes, an elegant royal gathering had become the setting for a confrontation years in the making. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie felt the shift before anyone spoke to her. Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, Anne, Edward, and senior household aides had gathered at Windsor. Yet conversations stopped when she approached. The gala carried more than social weight. Influence and future responsibilities were quietly measured. The Queen Consort, meaning the king's wife who supports the monarch in public duties without ruling, understood how carefully rank was guarded. One aide drew Sophie aside and gave her a documented account of what had been discussed behind closed doors. Camilla, the aide said, had privately pressed for her removal from an expanded ceremonial and advisory role, a position combining public duties with trusted input on family planning. The reason was explosive. Her growing prominence was allegedly beginning to blur the hierarchy around the Queen Consort. Sophie listened without interrupting, placed her untouched glass down, and asked only, "Who else knows?" Her voice hid the sting. Camilla saw the exchange from across the gathering and tightened. She recognized the expressions. She knew the secret had escaped. Edward approached his wife, saw the shock beneath her composure, and asked what had happened. Sophie refused to explain yet, not from fear, but because she would not let him react before she chose her response. He stayed close, while she fought to keep control. Then the disclosure widened. The aides said the private discussions had included seating arrangements, ceremonial assignments, and a recommendation that Sophie be kept outside a Windsor planning circle, meaning the inner group that helps coordinate family appearances. Anne noticed her stillness. William noticed it too. Catherine watched Sophie choose not to retreat, while Charles remained unaware of how close the evening was to breaking open. Sophie straightened herself and moved toward the center of the gathering. Camilla saw her coming. Edward followed at a distance. Anne did not look away, and William understood that something decisive was about to happen. But before Sophie could confront Camilla, one painful question had to be answered. Why had her growing place inside the royal family become threatening enough for anyone to try to contain it? I'll keep future sections moving faster, and slight variation around the requested word count is fine. I'll also preserve your supplied hook and transition line while maintaining continuous narrative flow. Sophie had never built her position through spectacle. That was precisely what made her influence so difficult to measure and increasingly difficult to ignore. Year after year, she had become the royal family member people trusted when ceremonies grew uncomfortable, relationships became strained, or private tensions threatened to become public. Now at Windsor, that reputation had placed her directly across from Camilla, and neither woman could pretend the stakes were merely ceremonial anymore. Sophie had earned that trust slowly, through consistency rather than ambition. In this telling, her role as a working royal meant she regularly carried out official duties on behalf of the monarchy, while also becoming someone Charles, Anne, William, Catherine, and Edward could rely on when situations required discretion. She rarely demanded attention. That was exactly why her influence mattered. People listened because she did not appear to be fighting for power. Camilla, however, was carrying a different burden. The Queen Consort faced the pressure of protecting her place inside a monarchy being reshaped by younger generations and changing public expectations. Authority was no longer measured only by title. Visibility, trust, and relationships mattered too, and Sophie possessed all three without appearing to seek them. For Camilla, that could make every small shift feel larger than it was. Sophie felt the wound deepen when she finally spoke privately to Edward. She told him she had never asked to stand above anyone. She had never tried to compete with Camilla, never treated loyalty as a path toward greater rank. What hurt was the possibility that years of service had somehow been interpreted as a threat. Edward reacted instantly. Protective anger rose in him, and he wanted answers before the night went any further. Sophie stopped him with a hand on his arm. This had to be her decision, she insisted. She would not allow the confrontation to become a husband defending his wife when the deeper issue concerned her own place within the family. Catherine found Sophie soon afterward and immediately sensed the strain. She did not need every detail. Sophie's controlled anger told the princess enough. Then Catherine admitted something unsettling. She had noticed several recent occasions when Sophie's expected involvement suddenly changed at the last moment. Each adjustment had seemed harmless alone. Together, they looked like a pattern. That realization sharpened when Sophie learned Anne had questioned one of those changes weeks earlier and received no convincing explanation. Anne had not forgotten it. Neither had Catherine. Now the scattered moments finally pointed somewhere. And when Sophie traced the first unexplained change back through the palace calendar, she found the moment that transformed quiet unease into something far more personal. The first fracture had not occurred at the gala. It had happened months earlier, in a room where almost nobody thought history was being made. There had been no shouting, no dramatic exit, no public scandal. Just a ceremonial rehearsal, a revised list, and one sentence spoken softly enough that Sophie never heard it herself. But an aide did. And when that sentence resurfaced at Windsor, every unexplained slight suddenly had a beginning. 3 months earlier, Camilla had attended a fictional ceremonial rehearsal inside St. George's Hall when she quietly spoke to a senior organizer about Sophie's place in the event. According to the aide's later documented account, the Queen Consort asked that Sophie be moved out of the principal receiving line and given a smaller role in the planning discussion afterward. A receiving line is simply the formal order in which senior royals greet important guests, but inside palace life, that order carries meaning. Position can signal trust, status, and visibility. Sophie never knew why the arrangement changed. Hours later, she received a revised schedule, saw that her position had shifted, and accepted it without protest. She assumed organizers had made a practical adjustment. That response only deepened the discomfort of one longtime aide who knew the alteration had not been routine. He watched her accept the change with the same quiet discipline she had shown for years, and guilt began to settle over him. Camilla's motive, in this dramatized account, was less about one rehearsal than what Sophie represented. The Queen Consort feared that influence inside the family was beginning to move in ways formal rank could not fully control. Sophie had Charles's confidence, Anne's respect, William and Catherine's trust, and Edward's unwavering support. She did not need to demand prominence. It seemed to follow her naturally. Anne noticed the revised order almost immediately. She studied the list, tapped Sophie's altered position with one finger, and asked who had changed it. Nobody answered her directly. The Princess Royal did not push the matter publicly, but she remembered the silence. Then more adjustments followed. Sophie was left out of 2 small planning conversations she would normally have joined. Catherine noticed those changes too, though at the time they appeared unrelated. The aide carried the truth for months. At Windsor, he finally gave Sophie the documented account of what he had heard during that rehearsal. Suddenly, she had a specific instruction, a witness, and a pattern she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. By the time Sophie turned back toward the gala, she was no longer searching for an explanation, she was walking toward the woman she believed owed her one. There was no audience when the decisive conversation began. No microphones. No announcement. Sophie simply approached Camilla, waited until the surrounding conversation faded, and asked whether they could speak privately. The Queen Consort understood immediately. What followed was not a screaming match, but something more dangerous inside a royal household. A controlled conversation in which both women knew that one careless sentence could permanently alter how they saw each other. Sophie did not circle around the issue. She asked Camilla directly whether she had personally requested that her Windsor responsibilities be reduced. The question landed with unusual force, because there was nowhere to hide behind ceremony now. The queen consort resisted the accusation, insisting that the discussion had concerned structure, not punishment. In her view, clearly defined roles protected the monarchy from confusion at a time when public expectations and family responsibilities were constantly shifting. Sophie refused to let that explanation soften what had happened. Her voice stayed quiet, but the anger underneath it was unmistakable. She told Camilla that changing someone's place without speaking to them first turns structure into humiliation. Royal precedence, the formal order that determines where family members stand or appear at official occasions, might explain rank, but this dispute had moved beyond rank. It was about influence, trust, and decisions being made behind closed doors. Then, Sophie named St. George's Hall. Camilla paused. That hesitation mattered. Within this dramatized account, Sophie immediately understood that the aide's documented testimony had touched something real. She pressed no harder than necessary. She simply waited, forcing the queen consort to decide whether she would deny everything or finally acknowledge the deeper fear behind the decision. Camilla chose the second path. She admitted that she had become concerned by how often household staff, relatives, and even members of the public seemed to look toward Sophie as a stabilizing female presence whenever tensions rose. She did not call it jealousy, she called it uncertainty, but Sophie heard the meaning beneath the language. Camilla reached for her glass and left it untouched. Sophie stepped half a pace back and told her she had never wanted another woman's position. She had never asked to replace anyone. She wanted only the dignity of being told when decisions affecting her were being made. Then Sophie asked the question that changed everything. Did Charles know? Camilla did not answer immediately. That silence struck harder than denial. Sophie had entered the conversation believing she was confronting one woman's private insecurity. Now she faced the possibility that the decision had traveled much higher. And that single unanswered question shifted the crisis from a private rivalry into something much more dangerous, a test of who actually controlled Windsor's internal order. Inside royal life, influence and authority are not always the same thing. Someone may suggest, someone may pressure, someone may quietly reshape a guest list or meeting. But only certain people can make those changes endure. That distinction suddenly mattered to Sophie more than anything else. If Camilla had merely expressed discomfort, the wound was personal. If Charles had approved a deliberate effort to reduce her position, the betrayal reached the center of the monarchy itself. Charles now faced the question Sophie had forced into the open. In this fictional scenario, the monarch holds final authority over many internal household arrangements, while senior relatives and private secretaries, the senior advisors who help organize royal duties and decisions, can recommend changes. That meant Camilla could influence a discussion, but lasting alterations usually required wider approval. William could not simply overrule his father, yet as the future king, his judgment carried enormous weight whenever the monarchy's long-term working structure was involved. Charles withdrew with the written summary prepared from the aide's documented accounts. He read quietly until he reached the passage concerning Sophie. Then he stopped. The king set the paper down without speaking, because the language in front of him suggested something far more personal than the administrative explanation he remembered approving. He had believed he was simplifying overlapping responsibilities. Now he was being told that one woman may have been singled out because another felt threatened. Anne did not allow him much time to retreat into silence. She entered, closed the door, and confronted her brother with the directness he knew too well. The Princess Royal told Charles that whether he had initiated the decision no longer mattered. If he discovered it had been unfair and still refused to correct it, then he would become responsible for preserving it. Charles admitted that he had approved what had been described as streamlining, a simple term for reducing or reorganizing duties to make the household easier to manage. But he insisted nobody had told him Sophie's prominence was part of the concern. The palace note he had seen used neutral language about efficiency, schedules, and clearer responsibilities. The personal motive described by the aides had been buried beneath careful wording. William reacted differently when the account reached him. He argued that Sophie deserved two things immediately: the restoration of the responsibilities she had lost, and a direct explanation of how the decision had happened. For the prince, anything less would deepen the damage, because the issue was no longer about ceremony, it was about trust. Charles understood the choice in front of him. Protecting the existing arrangement might spare Camilla immediate embarrassment, but reversing it would expose how deeply the palace had mishandled Sophie. The king could delay the explanation, but he could not delay the consequences, and before midnight, one unmistakable decision would show Sophie exactly where she stood. The palace did not need an announcement for everyone at Windsor to understand that something had changed. It happened through a decision so simple that its meaning became impossible to hide. A revised instruction was passed quietly. One name returned to a place from which it had been removed. Another royal realized that the effort to manage that influence had failed, and suddenly Camilla was confronting something she feared far more than gossip: loss of trust inside the family itself. Charles made the decision before the evening ended. Sophie would return to the expanded ceremonial and advisory responsibilities that had been reduced after the St. George's Hall rehearsal. The correction was immediate. Those responsibilities included both public royal duties and a closer role in private planning. So restoring them carried a meaning far beyond one event. It told everyone involved that her earlier reduction had not survived scrutiny. Edward delivered the news quietly. Sophie listened, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the relief settle without celebrating. She had wanted the unfairness corrected, but victory was not what she felt. Restoration could return responsibility. It could not erase the knowledge that years of loyalty had once been treated as something dangerous enough to contain. Edward understood that difference, and instead of pushing her to feel relieved, he simply stayed beside her. Charles told Camilla himself. She became still as he explained what he had decided, then asked whether reversing the arrangement was meant to embarrass her. The king rejected that immediately. He told her this was not revenge, it was correction. Sophie should never have been made to feel that her reliability, relationships, or service were threats to another woman's position. Camilla absorbed the answer in silence. For the first time that evening, she understood something painful. Charles would not automatically defend every decision simply because it had been presented as protecting her authority. The queen consort had feared losing influence to Sophie, yet the attempt to control that influence had created exactly what she feared most: distance inside the family. Charles went further. He instructed that the aides who had given truthful, documented accounts of the internal discussions were not to be punished merely for revealing what had happened. The decision closed one path to retaliation, but it did not repair the emotional damage already done. Sophie told Edward that the restored role still was not what she needed most. She needed to know whether Charles truly trusted her. Camilla left early after a restrained farewell. Charles watched her departure without calling her back. Before Sophie left Windsor, she sent him one message: 10 minutes alone. No courtiers, no prepared explanation. The public position had been restored, but Sophie's real turning point would come only when rank, aides, and royal protocol disappeared from the room entirely. For all the ceremony surrounding monarchy, the most important conversation of the night required none of it. Sophie and Charles sat without aides, secretaries, or family members nearby. There was no document between them, and no formal language to hide behind. She had spent the evening discovering what others thought of her influence. Now she wanted something simpler from the king himself: the truth about whether her loyalty was valued or merely tolerated. Sophie spoke first. She told Charles she could accept being asked to step back if the monarchy genuinely required it. What she could not accept was being quietly diminished while the same household continued praising her loyalty, discretion, and service. That contradiction had wounded her more than the lost responsibilities themselves. Silence, she said, had protected the institution for years. But silence had also allowed others to decide what she should endure without ever asking how much it cost her. Charles did not defend the process. The king admitted that he had approved recommendations written in vague administrative language, without asking enough questions about what those changes actually meant. By doing that, he said, he had allowed one person's insecurity to become an institutional decision. Household procedure, the internal system used to organize royal duties, schedules, and responsibilities, should have protected fairness. Instead, it had hidden the real reason Sophie was being pushed aside. Sophie listened, then made her own position clear. She would continue serving, she would remain dependable, but she would no longer pretend that staying silent was always the same thing as being loyal. Sometimes loyalty required speaking before resentment hardened into something worse. Charles answered without hesitation. Sophie's restored Windsor responsibilities were hers because her work mattered to the monarchy, not because Camilla needed to be punished. He told her directly that her value did not depend on whether another member of the family felt comfortable with her popularity or relationships. That mattered. Sophie's anger did not disappear, but something inside it softened. For the first time that night, she no longer feared that her place depended on Camilla's approval. Charles had taken responsibility, and that honesty changed the emotional balance between them. Then he revealed what would happen next. He intended to tell Camilla that no senior royal could use household procedure to manage another family member's popularity, friendships, or influence. Sophie paused before leaving and thanked him not for restoring her role, but for finally speaking plainly. By morning, however, Windsor could no longer contain what had happened. What had begun as a whispered leak behind palace doors was about to acquire a life beyond Windsor, and one public moment would define how the country understood it. By sunrise, the royal household had lost control of the rhythm of the story. People did not know every private sentence spoken at Windsor, but they knew enough. Sophie had emerged from the gala with her responsibilities restored. Camilla had left earlier than expected, and aides had exposed a bitter internal disagreement. Then came the image that transformed private tension into public symbolism. Sophie arrived for duty the next morning, and the crowd's reaction said more than any palace statement could. Reports of the fictional Windsor leak spread quickly, and the central claim was impossible to miss. Sophie's responsibilities had allegedly been reduced after private concerns were raised about her growing influence inside the family. The palace responded carefully, saying working roles were reviewed from time to time, and emphasizing that Sophie continued to hold the monarch's full confidence. It was restrained language, designed to calm rather than inflame. But by then, the public had already begun forming its own judgment. Sophie arrived at Windsor Castle for a scheduled engagement and found a small crowd waiting outside. One voice called, "We appreciate you, Sophie." Then others began applauding. She stopped only briefly. The response clearly moved her, but she offered a restrained smile and continued inside, rather than turning the moment into celebration. That restraint mattered. She had spent the previous night insisting she did not want anyone else humiliated, and now she refused to behave as though applause had crowned a winner. The moment exploded across fictional television coverage. One bulletin reduced the entire dispute to 3 words: Sophie steps forward. The phrase spread rapidly, because it seemed to capture more than her arrival. It suggested resolve, survival, and a woman refusing to disappear simply because her influence had made someone uncomfortable. Camilla watched the coverage privately. The applause hurt, because it appeared to confirm precisely what she had feared, that Sophie possessed a kind of trust no internal arrangement could easily control. Yet the queen consort also understood the painful irony. The attempt to restrict that popularity had only magnified it. Camilla made no public counterattack. She did not challenge the aides, criticize Sophie, or contradict Charles. That silence became significant because it suggested she understood the internal fight had reached its end. Sophie remained equally careful. When asked privately whether she felt vindicated, she answered that the family gained nothing when one woman's dignity required another woman's humiliation. That answer shifted the meaning again, and once the applause faded, the monarchy was left with a harder verdict, one that had less to do with rank than with the price of confusing influence, loyalty, and fear. In the end, the Windsor leak did not transform Sophie into something new. It revealed what had already happened quietly over years. She had earned trust without demanding attention, influence without fighting for rank, and affection without treating another woman's position as something to seize. Camilla's mistake was not believing Sophie wanted the crown beside Charles. It was believing that genuine loyalty could be contained simply because its growing power made someone else uncomfortable. Charles settled the question privately within the family. Sophie's restored ceremonial and advisory responsibilities would remain, not as temporary compensation for what happened at the gala, but because the king believed her work had lasting value. Ceremonial responsibilities are the formal public duties carried out on behalf of the monarchy, while advisory responsibilities involve trusted input behind the scenes. Sophie responded exactly as those closest to her expected. She returned to duty, completed her next engagement, and refused to turn the private dispute into a public campaign. Camilla faced the harder reckoning. The queen consort accepted that protecting her own standing could not mean limiting another person's usefulness. That realization hurt, because it forced her to confront the insecurity beneath the original decision. Days later, she and Sophie spoke privately again. There was no dramatic reconciliation. Camilla simply admitted the situation should have been handled differently. Sophie answered that honesty at the beginning would have prevented humiliation at the end. Sophie did not demand a public apology, and Camilla did not interfere again. Their relationship became more careful, perhaps less comfortable, but also more truthful. Charles drew his own lesson from the crisis. Avoiding difficult conversations had created a much larger problem. From then on, disagreements over royal roles would have to be discussed directly with the person affected. Edward watched Sophie move forward without bitterness and understood what she had protected. She had defended herself without asking him to fight for her. William and Catherine reached a similar conclusion. The prince and princess saw that the monarchy's future could not survive through hierarchy alone. Trust between those carrying its responsibilities mattered just as much. The Windsor Gala therefore became more than a story about rivalry. It became a warning about what happens when loyalty is mistaken for ambition. Sophie did not become powerful because Camilla became weaker. She became impossible to dismiss because, when challenged, she chose neither silence nor cruelty. The leak exposed insecurity, damaged trust, and forced an uncomfortable reckoning, but it also clarified Sophie's place beyond argument. Sophie stepped forward, not to replace Camilla, not to defeat her, and not to claim a position that belonged to someone else. She stepped forward because Windsor had finally forced her to defend the place she had already earned, and once she did, nobody inside the palace could quietly move her backward again. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.